All right, so we'll get started here. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Smita Mishra, founder and CEO of Pandoro Technologies. Pandoro Technologies is built with a vision to enable the investors and businesses of the next economy be more responsible by helping them identify and manage their sustainability related goals using SDGs, ESG risks, and opportunities. So, founded in 2018 in India, we are a fast growing consulting firm powered by a SaaS platform, software as a service platform, that enables leaders of today and tomorrow to be more planet positive by helping them in monitoring and managing their ESG risks, metrics, and sustainability impact. We do support our clients with bespoke consulting services and offer remote sustainability team in case they have limited or no teams to work dedicatedly on their sustainability roadmap. I welcome you all to this edition uh, of the Responsible Investor and Business webinar series. The series was created as a forum for discussion to engage the real actors and sustainability practitioners who are actively working and taking real actions towards adopting sustainable development in the investment and private business space. We wish to have this as the platform to build awareness on sustainability and the current industry practices, discuss some successful existing solutions, and also explore newer innovations for solving the complex and interrelated challenges of sustainable development, with the idea to minimize the negative impact while maximizing the positive impact of businesses and investors on the environment and society, and doing all of this with a good, transparent, and effective corporate governance. All right. Yeah, so a growing topic of interest and debate is around the SDG or Sustainable Development Goals and their role in investing and private businesses. And given this growing interest and genuine curiosity on this topic, we are holding a series of webinars to this topic to discuss and debate the various viewpoints. Today is the first in this series of Responsible Investors and Business webinar. The topic today is Measuring SDG Impact Assurance Framework, which is intended to explore the work done by UNDP SDG Impact team, particularly on investor mapping and assurance framework. We will hear from the panelists how can we leverage the investments and private businesses for a higher adoption of sustainability, and how do we do that in true spirit and not just greenwashing. In fact, Jeremy, who is on our panel, suggested the title to be UNDP SDG Impact, Catalyzing Investment to Achieve the SDGs, which I truly believe is the more appropriate title. But we had just published all the collaterals, and so we couldn't make that change. Sorry about that, Jeremy. Before we get started with the actual session and introduce our esteemed panelists, quick housekeeping points. The panel discussion is going to be there for about 35-40 odd minutes, and we plan to do a quick Q&A with the audience for the last 15 minutes of the hour. So please submit your questions through the chat with your name, and we'll raise them with the panelists. We would love to have this webinar be more interactive, so it is more useful and meaningful to your specific questions. Please do put forth your thoughts and queries. With that as the background, let's get started with the discussion with our panelists today. Joining us on the panel are Ms. Devavati Chaudhary, the SDG Impact Specialist for Asia Pacific and ASEAN, and Mr. Jeremy Nichols, the Assurance Framework Lead for the UNDP SDG Impact Standards. So, very warm welcome, Devavati and Jeremy. You can unmute yourself, and it would be great to start with a quick round of introduction from you. So, let me start with you, Devavati. Tell us more about your professional background, your experience, and your current role, and also about the role of UNDP SDG Impact team.
Sure. Thank you so much for a warm welcome, Smita. And hello, everyone, whoever is in the room. I can see 15 people in the session. Um, so I am working with UNDP since past 2 years with the SCG Impact team, and something you've already mentioned, Smita. We are focused on looking at driving private sector capital to the SCGs and really building tools and insights around it to help the private sector not only contribute to the SDGs but also authenticate that contribution in making sure that they're contributing positively to the people and the planet. So my current work is really involved in working with UNDP country offices, with private sector stakeholders on making that happen. So a lot of activity happening in the APAC region, for instance, in terms of investor mapping that I'll be shortly speaking about, and also driving the standards that Jeremy will be speaking about. In terms of the professional background, I have about 15 years of work experience. My core experience has been mostly in the financial inclusion space. I worked a lot in the microfinance and management consulting around microfinance, and then really around social performance management and responsible finance, and putting together code of conducts, around how microfinance should operate. So a lot of work has been around, working with microfinance institutions, small finance banks, payment banks, in sort of, pushing the social performance management along with the great financial performance that a lot of these companies have, gone on to show. Some of them also having been listed on the IPOs as IPOs. What my work has really involved is something that has flown into what I'm doing now, which is essentially seeing how social performance and commercial viability can walk hand in hand, and you can in fact drive impact with commercial viability and sustainability. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the session. Over to you, Jeremy.
Fighting for access there. So, hello everybody. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be with you. We're a relatively small group, so I suspect our presentation may leave more time for questions, and so that we can, focus as much as possible on the things you would like to tease out from us. I've been with the UNDP's SDG Impact team for a bit less, actually, probably 9 months now, I think, something like that. Prior to that, I was running an organization called Social Value International, which I had previously founded, which is an international community of people measuring, managing the impact of their organizations. That had a number of networks around the world, and consequently, I was a fairly frequent visitor to various parts of India, running training and developing the network and support that we were doing through that. Further back in time, I am actually an accountant by training, and so a lot of my approach and thinking when we come to these issues is constantly using that as a reference point, and I suspect I might do that again in some of the Q&A we have later on today. I escaped accounting by spending 4 years as a house husband at home with my son. They go to school, you then think, what do I do next? And so I got back into the world of then. I didn't go back into accounting at that point. I got into the world of sustainability, social enterprise, and regeneration, and that's the route which has brought me now to be working on the SDG Impact Standards, which we are about to talk to you about in a little more detail.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Devavati, both of you for the quick introduction. And it's a shame we never met, Jeremy, that you've been so many times to India. And
next time.
Yes, there's always a next time. So let's get started with a quick discussion, starting with really the interest area is firstly to understand what does UNDP SDG Impact team do overall. So when I go to the site and when I look at what you really do, there are things mentioned as impact management, intelligence, and impact facilitation. And in fact, one of my core interest areas was to look at impact management, where there are SDG impact standards mentioned, there is impact assurance mentioned, and particularly for private equity, for bonds, for enterprises. So what is it that really the team does, and how does it impact the investment in enterprises?
We have some slides, Smita, so perhaps it would be easiest if we whisked through those, and then we can share those as well, which give a bit of context and answer that question and perhaps some others. So shall I go to our slides and then run through those, and then we can go to Q&A? Is that
sure? We can do that.
Well? Fantastic. Share screen. I've got to find the right slide. This is the bit where we struggle to find it. There it is. Right. Hopefully you can all that. Is that okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So we're going to run through a little bit of introduction, and then I'll hand over to Devavati to talk about the investor maps, and then back to me to talk about the standards. The big picture, I think, is important in this because we're living in a world where increasingly we're facing significant and growing challenges, and and time is running out to deal with some of these. People's lives are now being affected as we speak by the consequences of climate change, by rising inequality, by the shifts that are happening in terms of the growing numbers of people that are having to leave their homes and move somewhere else. So there's a world with challenge. And all these things are also interlocked and interlinked, that this is the kind of frame, I think, for the scale of the challenge that we're facing. Now, when the SDGs were agreed, which is some time back now, the idea was we were going to solve the problems by 2030, which is now only 8 years ago. But at that point, it was often discussed as a financial gap, as that if we could move some of the existing investment or align that investment with the goals of the SDGs, then we could achieve them. It was about shifting finance. And in the scale of investment that was flowing around the world, it wasn't that big a shift that was actually needed. That is going backwards at the moment. The results of COVID, amongst other the problems we're facing, are meaning that gap is currently widening. So the financial gap is widening. And were we to look at some of the indicators, some of those are going backwards as well at the moment. So that the challenge is getting bigger. We're not actually on track. We still live in a world where we are primarily pursuing profit and then trying to deal with the consequences of that behavior after the event. We are recognizing, however, that governments are starting to realize this as well and starting to act. We are recognizing that policy as well as practitioners are seeing how all these things come together. But we don't think that at the moment we've still got that sense of urgency, that the kind of realization that if we don't all move now, it's not that we're just going to miss those targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, but the knock-on effects are going to start, and probably already are, affecting all our lives, but are going to do so in ways which are becoming increasingly systemic and increasingly difficult to deal with. And so the whole point behind the SDG Impact team's work was to help catalyze these investments, was to help identify two things. Where should that money go in order to best contribute? And once it's gone in the right place, how should we go around managing the impact that they're having so that we are comfortable that we are achieving that contribution to sustainability at the rate that we need? And I think this question about the rate we'll keep coming back to, because it's not just a question of having more impact than we did last year. It's a question of having that impact, that net positive impact, at the rate that we need to if we're going to avoid these challenges. And this means putting sustainability at the heart of business rather than as an add-on. And that is quite a shift when we still live in a world where a lot of the time we're saying, well, we're running a businesses and let's start thinking about sustainability. Whereas at the heart of our team's work and both the investor maps and the standards is to say, well, hang on, maybe we should start thinking about sustainability as being the driver, and then we need to make a financial return within that context. So starting to flip them, moving via the integration of the two together. So, yes, we hear a lot about it, but there are a lot of risks in this at the moment. Everyone's talking about it. We're all on there with ESG this moment and sustainability the other. But there are lots of people who are concerned about the fact that it's kind of easy to jump on board this. And as human beings, we all want to be contributing to a better world. It's a very natural consequence. But as human beings, we also tend to undergo all sorts of cognitive dissonance challenges, which actually make it hard for us to make the level of change that we probably do need to be making. When you get to the end of one of those programs or courses and they ask you, what are you going to do tomorrow? There's two things. There's the things you're going to do tomorrow that are comfortable, and the things that you think you should do tomorrow, but you won't because they're a little bit too challenging. And it's that second set that we think we really need to be starting to focus on. Our concerns are consequently that much of the current approaches simply are not going to get us there fast enough. They're not going to address the needs of the population of the world and our ecosystems to maintain them, to regenerate them, and to think about the opportunities to increase well-being of our people and planet more generally, that we really need to ramp this up. Yes, we're increasingly seeing opportunities for people thinking about this. Yes, we're starting to see how people are focusing on reporting. One of the most important things about our work is that, we'll come back to it, it's not really about reporting, it's about putting that internal machine running, if you want, that really does drive the performance that we need to see. Now, we've not been around for very long. This was kind of launched back in 2018, which now I suppose is 4 years, but time flies. And during that time, we have been developing the outline bits of the work. We've launched a number of, there's a lot of information now on our website. We're now in the throes of starting to develop the training courses and other bits of the support packages that go around that. But you just get a sense that it's not been that long in the scale of things, but it has been 3 years of that clock ticking away to 2030. And the main areas then that we look at as a team are the intelligence piece of where should we get the money to if we're going to shift, if we're going to be that catalytic change, we need to start redirecting financial flows. And that means helping people identify opportunities where there are possibilities for actually having those returns whilst having that positive contribution to sustainability at the scale that we required. And once we've sorted that out, we can then start to say, well, okay, once we've got it there, we need to make sure that the decisions being made in the operation of those investments are actually making that net positive contribution at the rate that is possible and necessary. And then alongside that is the facilitation of that, where we are, much of the UNDP's work is around policy development through our country offices. And so a lot of work is ongoing there around the levels of discussion and support and thinking about the interface between both the public and the private sector. So the public sector is seeing opportunities for setting the environment which would encourage these. And we won't go into that any more detail, but just to give you the example that we're working with a number of stock exchanges, to start to develop the way in which they operate and the way in which they can require information from businesses that are seeking a listing on an exchange to start to relate that back to the work that we're doing more widely. So on that note, I will hand over to Devahuti, and shall I run the slides for you and let you shout when you need me to move?
Sounds good, Jeremy, and thanks. So this is just about the intelligence piece that Jeremy touched upon. So we're going to dive a little bit into how do these SDG investor maps work? Why were they created in the first place? What methodology drives that process, and really what are we getting out of it? With an insight into what we got from the India investor map that was prepared in 2020. With the next slide, please, Jeremy. Okay, and I'm going to keep an eye on the clock because, like Jeremy mentioned, we have a small, intimate group, so we should spend a lot of time on questions and bantering a little bit, going back and forth. So the SDG Investor Map methodology. Now, this piece of intelligence, or market intelligence, like we call it, at the heart of this process, what we are trying to do is to really bring together, in a particular country context, what are the most challenging development needs, which have so far lagged in spite of private sector or public sector push towards those challenges. So what are those? And for that, to identify those, we use the SDG framework because, as you know, most of the countries and most of the UN member nations who have subscribed to the SDGs, they do come up with SDG dashboards. So there is information and intelligence already available on what are the SDGs that need to be prioritized the most. The second lens that we apply here is what are the areas where the policy momentum is the highest. So where is it that the government is pushing for reforms? The government is pushing for better fiscal or tax sort of benefits for the private sector to participate in, where they see value of private sector coming in and contributing to those policy push. And then the third piece that we look at is the private sector interest itself. Right. So where is it that the private sector sees value in its participation in a particular country context? So bringing these three pieces together, development challenges, policy momentum, and private sector interests, the sectors, subsectors that lie at the intersection of these three analysis is where, we start our work on the investor maps. And from those sectors, like you see the funnel process here on the slide, From those sectors, we then try and see what are those subsectors where the development need is the highest, where more investment and policy momentum is required, and where is it that we should therefore put our attention to in terms of the mapping work. And finally, we also look at use a lens of around regions. I mean, in India, especially, we understand the challenge. We are a very diverse country. There are so many different regions. Each have a very different play in terms of what the development needs are, what kind of sectors can thrive there, how is it that we can create better job opportunities, or where is it that health facilities are lagging. So with those different kind of factors playing a part in how we choose those regions, we do a ranking at this level to also understand where those regional priorities lie. And finally, with those sectors, subsectors, and regions that feed into those three lenses that I first talked about, which is development challenges, public policy push, and private sector interests, we start looking at that stage at investment opportunity areas. So what are these areas really? So these are the areas where the business models are most impactful, and where any sort of additional private sector capital can drive impact at scale. So with that, probably if you could move to the next slide, Jeremy. So we've been doing this exercise across the globe. We already have 19 maps prepared and hosted on our SDG Investor platform. In the APAC, again, a lot of activity happening. You can see there are maps for India, China already prepared. And most recently, we also released a map for Indonesia. And in the ASEAN, again, we have a lot of activity happening with Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia coming and launched in the next couple of months. And in South Asia, our neighbors, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan will also be soon launching the map. So a lot of not just country level intelligence, but regional intelligence coming together to inform, public sector policy as well as private sector participation. Next slide, please. So you would be curious now that with all of this information coming together, what are some of the trends that we can see? And I've here focused on the South Asia region. So what you see here in terms of SDG aligned sectors are, sectors such as agriculture, healthcare, education that are typically seen as social sectors where you see more of government participation. But surprisingly, these are also areas where private sector is really interested in looking at interesting business models, especially with increasing digitalization, technology coming in a big way in creating asset lean business models that don't need a lot of upfront cash investment, but can yield great results and also help scale up, beyond just urban areas. So those are some of the models that are coming up in a big way in terms of private sector interests. Then we also have infrastructure. And mostly in infrastructure for the investor maps, we don't look at some really large, let's say, roadways or, shipping, those kind of sectors, but we look more closely at affordable housing sectors, subsectors such as waste management, water utilities and services. Those have a direct bearing on the SDGs. And then we also look at renewable energy, which is, a usual suspect when you start looking at SDG related sectors. Also because climate finance and climate related themes are becoming increasingly important with the whole dialogue that is happening around climate change, and really seeing then on a sustained basis, beyond just philanthropic money coming into some of these themes, what can the private sector do? And to Jeremy's point, it just can't be one part or one percentage of the portfolio, but you need to in entirety think about how that huge capital of that is driven by the private sector can contribute to some of these themes. And finally, about financial inclusion, we are looking at MSME financing in a big way across countries. This has also been apart from being relevant because emerging markets are largely driven by MSMEs. A huge part of the working force are actually small-time entrepreneurs, micro-entrepreneurs who are contributing to the economy in a big way. So how do we provide working capital and capacity building support to spur domestic growth through some of these investment themes is again that we've been exploring. And for the SDG investor maps, because it's an SDG investor map and because we're trying to create a shared language between commercial viability and impact, we also look at strong underpinning themes around gender, across the investment themes that we explore. So for every investment opportunity that you will see on our investor platform, you would also see what bearing does that have on gender in terms of women's participation in workforce at a very simple level, and then also on some of these social issues that we are trying to combat. So for in terms of education, participation of women and girls in school, adolescents at, let's say secondary education levels, how is the transition happening for women across these educational institutes. So those are some of the issues that we continue to grapple and capture in terms of intelligence in our maps. Next slide, please. So I'll be very quick, and this just speaks to my point on how we are trying to create a shared language between impact and commercial viability. So what you see here on the slide are essentially the data points that we capture when we look at investment opportunity areas in our maps. So for each of those investment opportunity areas, so let's say within education sector, I'm looking at education technology. So within that, I may have education technology platforms for K-12 education technology for skill development, or education technology for learning management systems. So for each of these investment opportunity areas, these are the different kind of indicators for which we collect data. So some of the obvious ones are sector, subsector, etc. What kind of business models, case studies. But what I would draw your attention to is the impact case. So for each of these investment opportunities, we look at what kind of sustainable development need is it responding to? What are the expected development outcomes that you can expect if money is put into these investment opportunities? Which are the SDGs? And which are the SDG indicators in particular that this particular investment opportunity has the power to impact? Who are the stakeholders that are being impacted? Direct, indirect, corporates, governments, any sort of planetary outcomes? And then what are the outcome and impact risks? This for us is very important, because often what happens is we look at those comfortable spaces or things that look good in a report, that yes, I've been able to reach out to 60,000 people or X number of people in rural areas. But are there any negative externalities that are caused because of the projects that we are putting money into? So calculating those risks and putting those out as market intelligence is again something that we have been able to accomplish through the maps. And then finally, looking at the enabling environment. So is there this a sound policy environment, a sound regulatory environment that is available for the private sector to participate in? What kind of financial benefits, such as fiscal benefits or tax structures, that are available for the private sector to take, to benefit from? And who are the active actors in the space? Starting from the private sector players like investors, to corporates, to civil society organizations that act as collaborators. So all of that is mapped for every investment opportunity area that we look at. Next slide, please. Very quickly for the India map, this is the kind of mapping that we did. So we looked at the SDG priorities. We looked at Niti Aayog's India strategy at 75. It's their key document that looks at where the policy momentum is being pushed. And then we also looked at COVID-19 impact in a big way, because the India map was created in 2020. The COVID, the first wave had just gotten over. There was a lot of speculation around how long will this take, what might the impact or outcomes be. So we really took a close sort of look at what some of those social and economic outcomes could be. So we looked at one of the outcomes was greater adoption of digitalization. So how does that impact uptake of some of these products and services? There was mass migration of especially of low income households and families from urban areas back to their villages, loss of jobs. So we looked at exclusion in a big way, and what are those opportunities where which can help in that recovery process. So all of that was taken into account, and then we looked at these several sectors. We'll obviously be I don't know, Smith, if we'll be circulating the slides, but everybody can take a closer look at what those sectors are. And of course, we also have them hosted on the investor platform. But I'll quickly move to the next slide to talk about, what are some of the high level findings from the map. So for the India investor map, we discovered 18 investment opportunity areas across the 5 sectors. And then and these 5 sectors being, agriculture, education, healthcare, renewable energy, and financial inclusion. And we also looked at white spaces. Now, white spaces are those areas where, the private sector can have a play in terms of coming in and creating impact, but there are policy issues because of which they are not able to participate fully. So this is just some of the analysis we ran in terms of what kind of development needs are addressed by these 18 opportunity areas. So you see a large part of them are using technology as business solutions to drive scale. A lot of them are looking at inclusion related issues. So either they are dealing with marginalized communities, or they're looking at gender or inclusion of gender, or even certain marginalized segments such as aging populations. A lot of them are driving productivity, which again, responds to one of the issues around the negative impact of COVID. So these are just some of the analysis that came through. And then we also looked at investment timeframes, which was very interesting for investors because they are always interested to see if we are going to put our money in, how soon can we realize an exit, or how soon can we realize some sort of positive returns coming in. So we saw that about 53% of them were short term. So within 0 to 5 years of investments, they could realize a return, and so on for medium and long. So we have different stats for those. But the point that we are really trying to drive here is that with the development needs and by addressing SDGs, you can actually also look at commercial viability and on a pretty short term basis. So I'll just stop there. I do have a couple of slides, but I also want to have Jeremy go over standards. But this is what we found for India, and I'm happy for you to go through our SDG investor platform. Come back to us if you have any questions, and then I'm also happy to take questions later. Back to you, Jeremy.
You are on mute, Jeremy. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, I had to stop sharing to come off mute. Now we'll go back. Hopefully to the same place. Yay! Not to the same place. But that didn't work, so yes, brilliant. Okay, so sorry about that. So we have the money in the right place now. The question is that investment making a contribution to sustainability and the SDGs? Is it making a positive net contribution? Is it making that contribution at the rate that is needed? And so we have been developing standards of practice to help organizations put in place the policies and the activities inside their businesses that would be necessary in order to make sure that that contribution was happening. And this is a bit of a shift from what has been out there, because this is not focusing around performance. It's not about reporting an amount of an impact. It's not about reporting simply against the SDG indicators. It's about driving that through the organization's culture, and it's about making sure that the decision making is happening throughout all those decisions, informed by whether and the extent to which that decision is going to have a higher contribution as a result of making it. This pushes us through from a kind of operational level to more of a strategic level. It makes us think a lot more about risk. It is, I think, for many organizations, ends up being something of a change management program. We start by thinking that we can, make that contribution to an SDG. And I have seen many of the examples which Dahuti referred to of, we have reached 50,000 people. I've seen examples of businesses who say 51% of our workforce are women, and therefore we have achieved SDG 5. And I have to emphasize that might be the beginning, but it's not what we're thinking about when we think about making a net positive contribution to sustainability at the rate that's necessary. And so as organizations start on this journey, for many it becomes very much a change management program where we really start to shift from that, what about the performance, but what are we doing inside? Are we really aligning things inside our organization with those goals? And as we start to think about that, what does that mean for us? Standards are usable by all sorts of businesses, as well as the investors in those businesses. and as well as the people who are analysing and advising and thinking about both those portfolio allocation decisions, but also in terms of government and policymakers in terms of setting the scene. So we want to encourage this kind of system-wide thinking, which starts to say we need to move from this world where we are thinking about financial returns and then afterwards considering whether we are making some kind of contribution to one or two SDGs, to one where we start thinking about our net contribution to sustainability. And part of that contribution to sustainability obviously has to be that we're running commercially viable organizations. But as we start to think through this, you start to realize that at times it's not just the operations that need to change. It can be the way in which we think about value more generally. It can be the business model. It can be the strategy altogether. And so it can have quite big implications. Now we have developed 4 standards then really to focus on where the major financial flows are. Obviously, in the end, this is being delivered by enterprises on the ground. As I said, it's accessible to all businesses. I personally think that in many ways it's more accessible to smaller and medium-sized businesses because they are easier and fleeter of foot to make some of the changes in their businesses. They have more control, particularly if you have a family-owned firm. So in many ways, a medium-sized firm has significant employment, significant turnover, might be listed on a local stock exchange, but still has the opportunities to make some of these cultural shifts and change management relatively quickly. We've also been very interested in bond markets because so much finance flows through bond markets, both for national bonds, but also for corporate bonds. And then again, for the private equity side, so much of the finance is flowing through private equity sources. So these are the 3 main routes, but we have also created a standard with the OECD, which is a joint standard which looks at the development aid community and specifically is focusing then at development finance institutions. And often these then become involved either in local private equity funds or they are also behind the scenes funders within stock exchanges. And so this is the mix. The one that you don't see therefore there is a couple of things like pension funds or the public markets through stock exchanges, both of which where we think the focus is much more around the enterprise side of things at the moment. So the gap, we live in a world with so many of these standards out there that it's easy to go, oh dear, isn't it complex enough? But we do really believe that there is a gap here between the kind of general principles that we talk about. And for us, these are the UNGC's 10 principles. They're the UN Global Principles for Business and Human Rights. They are the Women's Empowerment Principles. They're the ILO standards. They're a set of core building blocks out there, which you then run over to the other side and everyone else is then suddenly talking about, well, which indicators should I use? And shouldn't we be standardizing indicators? And then we can report our information. And there's so many standards out there around GRI, SASB, and the way that's now integrated within the ISSB proposals. But we still think that there is this bit which is around management and strategy and transparency and governance inside an organization. And in many ways, these standards are therefore more comparable to the international standards, for example, ISO 14001 on environmental management or 9001 on quality management, than they are to the reporting standards like GRI. They obviously read across because our view is if you have the right decision-making processes in place, you will have a higher level of performance. And it's much more important that we start assessing whether that performance is as high as it could be and as high as it needs to be than it is we start assessing whether that performance is correctly set out. So we want to shift that to the decision-making framework in the middle. And so these are the bits that we have driving that, these 4 areas, which we think that are necessary to have in place if we're serious about making that contribution. That really does shift us because it starts to say it's no good looking at 1 or 2 SDGs. It's not even any good just looking at the SDGs. We need to consider the impacts. It's why it's SDG Impact standards, because we need to put the people who are experiencing the consequences of business operations at the heart of this decision. So I said at the beginning, I'm an accountant by training, and I've worked as a finance director, and I've lived in a world where we and the businesses are held to account every day for our performance in generating value for investors. And if we do not achieve the levels of performance expected by investors, we lose our jobs and our businesses cease to exist. They get bought out or they simply become uncompetitive and die. And we're all very used to living in that world. And we just wanted to imagine a world where instead, imagine that the people who experience the other consequences of a business operations, not just the financial returns, if they were able to hold businesses to account for their sustainability performance, what would that look like? And I'm pretty sure it would look like a world in where we would all have to make a lot more decisions a lot more quickly, driven this time by sustainability performance. And in many ways, that's what we've been trying to do with the SDG Impact Standards. We've been trying to imagine a world. What would it look like? And what would governance look like? What would strategy look like? What would management look like? And how transparent would we have to be around that? And focus so much then on decision making. Now, when you get into the standards, you'll go, oh, look, there's a lot of indicators in here. There's a whole bunch of stuff for each of those. You can download those standards and have a look at them. And this is just a quick summary of the kind of things that are going to be explored within that. Strategy is this commitment to contributing positively at the heart of the business, all through actually making sure that we are not just reporting on our impact, but we are measuring that impact against targets, that we recognize that we have to achieve a minimum level of performance before we can even say something is positive. We're getting used to that now with climate because we know we need to be net zero in 30 years, well, less than that now, but we're all starting to we've got to get to net zero, and what is our share of that? But in some areas, we're way behind. On gender equality, we are still happy, or some of us are still happy, to live with the expectation that we won't achieve gender equality on current trends for another 150 years, which seems to be completely ridiculous. So an organization is going to have to start thinking about gender equality as being rather more than the number of people in the workforce and the number of women on the board, but start thinking about the consequences of its products and services for women, whether there are unexpected indirect consequences that have not been thought through, whether products and services are fully accessible. All these issues are going to be part of that, and setting targets against that is going to be fundamental. So this all brings us back to, it's a change management program. It's going to require some hard and at times uncomfortable thinking as we start to really shift our way through that. Now on the website, I'll come to the other tools and things because we've got them in here. So there's a lot of stuff on the website now. You've got all these standards. You've got guidance notes. There is also, not on this slide, but there is also a self-assessment tool which organizations can work through and allows you to go through each of the indicators and say, are we doing this, yes or no? And if no, it allows you to say, how quickly could we do that? And how valuable would that be to us? And those two factors provide a very quick weighting, which allows you to say, well, these are the things we should do first, because they're the mix of ones which are quick and valuable, and then moving on through the other ones. And if at any point you look through those indicators and you go, there's a lot of these, just try replacing the words contribution to sustainability with the words financial returns and see how just normal all these indicators would suddenly become. We are so used to living in a world where all the things we're talking about in the standards are just day-to-day normality when we think about finance, and we need them to become just day-to-day normality when we think about sustainability. There is a free online training course which we developed with Duke's University, which you can just get on. It's online and you can work through that. And we're in the throes of finalizing user training for people who want to go a bit further in more detail. But I cannot overemphasize how important it is to just get going. There's a danger of feeling it's all too hard. But this, so much we're focusing on is decision making. It's not, are you perfect as a business? It's, are you making decisions with what you have? And are you starting to improve at the rate you need to be improving? And so we are developing an assurance framework, which I'll come back to. And we are developing these advisory services, but wanting to do that through other partners who we are developing and working with to make sure that they can take this message out. It will not just be the SDG Impact team. It'll be through the country offices. And we hope to develop that with a range of other networks and communities to do that more. The big risk here, I'm afraid, is impact, what we increasingly call impact washing. This is like somehow is a new idea because in the world of financial markets, everyone gets audited and no one notices it. We might not be happy about it, but we know we have to have that done. We get audited by an auditor who is acting in the interests of investors, and that's just the way it is. But it still seems something of a surprise to people that we should be auditing impact, acting in the interests of the people who experience that impact. And we're going to be doing that. We're going to be auditing, providing assurance that organizations are claim that they're meeting the requirements of the standards is true. And we will, within that, be developing a community of people who can provide that assurance service. And we're setting minimum levels of performance to start with. But those minimums come with you've got to do better over the next 2 years. There will be a continuous improvement plan alongside that, saying you get assured, you get what we're calling a seal to say that you have met that, but you won't keep the seal unless you continue to make these improvements. Because whilst we recognize that many businesses are not where we need to be tomorrow by now, and therefore we need to have a minimum starting point, we also need that minimum to be high enough to deal with all the risks that might be in place when we're talking about people's human rights. And in the end, this assurance service is the UNDP acting in the interest of people's human rights. And so it remains important that we do all the things here if we're going to build trust, if we're going to build integrity, but most importantly, if we're going to sit there as managers of businesses and hand on heart be able to say, we have met the seal, we are making these decisions, without someone pushing us along and encouraging us not to mark our own homework and think we've done things, when unfortunately we probably often have not done them at the rate that we need to be doing them. So that's us, a quick skim through. It's time for many of your questions.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Devoti, for actually sharing so much in detail about what you work on. And there are some couple of questions which I have already received. But before that, I wanted to understand if you could throw a little bit more light on the assurance framework and process in terms of by when should we expect that to be implemented.
I was trying to avoid that question, Smita. Yeah, so timescales on assurance. So we have a draft framework. We've been working with an advisory group of people who come from both the financial sectors, but also the ISO, the international standards bodies, the accreditation services that they provide. So we have a draft framework, and we have a starting point for what we think will be the minimum requirements. This is a terribly difficult balancing act between people saying make them lower and other people saying make them higher. And I think we have to remember that if the people who experience the consequences of businesses' operations were in the room, they would be higher. So, we're keeping that in mind. We are now finalizing the arrangements to start to develop the training course for the assurance providers. So that will be a pilot with a relatively small number. We will run that. We will no doubt make some changes, and then we will pilot the assurance framework with a small number of organizations that we hope will maybe not get the seal first time round, but we hope will be close, close to that. But that remains to be seen. And then we will no doubt make further revisions and then launch the whole thing. So it had better be this year, otherwise. So sometime this year, I would say. But given the difficulties that putting these systems in place takes, particularly when you're trying to converge and ensure consistency and not, reinventing the wheel, it's very good not to reinvent the wheel. But then that means you have to work with other organizations, and then you start to run into additional time requirements that you do not control, basically. So I'll just stick it with later this year, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I've myself gone through these standards, to be honest. I've seen the one for investors and I've seen the one for enterprises. I haven't yet, when I say investors, the private equity side, I haven't yet gone and explored the bonds standards. But I find them fairly straightforward. I mean,
excellent news.
While the subject is complex, while the problem that we are attacking is complex, but the stepwise approach that, this is what you do, then you start defining your strategy, and then you take it to your management, and then you start defining how do you really want to measure, what are your KPIs and metrics, and then you actually start monitoring them. And then there is a feedback loop for optimizing, like Once you've gone through it, let's optimize the whole process. So one is, of course, we are looking, partners like us are definitely looking forward to participate in this process of assurance. But the challenging part that I felt when I was working with a couple of investors and enterprises and trying to start adapting or implementing those stepwise process was, and we have gone through I've also gone through the Coursera session, the course on this. There is this area where you have to set objective, where you have to say that this is my target objective in this area. Let's say I choose to work in SDG 5, and as a business or as an investor I want to invest in that space. I find it a bit complicated on how do I set my target. How much? So there are other enterprises which have asked me questions like, if I invest X millions, how do I know I have gone Y steps further? So how do we really, solve this thing that this should be your ideal objective?
So the first thing I just want to check with you is when you said, if I've chosen SDG 5. It may be that you have a purpose around SDG 5, but the standards say, irrespective of that, you need to understand the positive and negative impacts that you will have across all the SDGs and any other impact. So there's a real danger of people going, I'm picking this and reporting on that, because that will not get us as a society where we need, because there's so much risk that in doing something goodish in one SDG, we're having serious and significant negative consequences.
Oh, that's interesting, Jeremy. So are you suggesting that as an investor or as an enterprise, when you are looking to build your SDG strategy, you should consider all 17?
You should consider all your expected material impacts. Now, when you look at all your expected material impacts, you may find that you don't have impacts in all 17.
Correct.
So it may not be all 17, but you do need to look at all the positive and negative impacts. And and identifying those has to come from a process of involvement of the people experiencing them. It can't come from you sitting in the boardroom going, this year we're going to do SDG 5.
So
now,
yes.
Of course, in year one, you may identify, a whole bunch of positive and negative impacts. And we're not saying you need to have all the data of best practice on all of them on day one, but you're going to need to do a minimum, and you'll need to go and get better at the other ones pretty quickly. So that is a relatively high bar. But if you think about it, if you don't have that information and you make a decision to start a new service or refine an existing one or go into a new market, and you don't have the data, you do not know whether your net effect is positive or negative. You may, whilst having a positive effect somewhere, be actually reducing well-being overall. So we do need to look at that. In terms of the targets, you're right. Target setting is never very easy. And even if so let's just imagine that in a financial world at the moment, when we set the budget for next year. Okay, so you go into you're the management team, and you've got to set a budget. Well, you generally start with last year's targets. But if it's a new startup, you don't have any. So, what's your target for next year? You're going to have a budget. You won't get any money from the bank if you don't have a target. So, so you try and set something. It's the best you can do. You're under pressure from your finances to set a reasonably challenging target. If you've got last year, you can use that. But you know what your competitors are doing. So if you don't respond to them, last year's target may be no good. But somewhere in that mix, you're going to come up with something. If you get it wrong, you'll probably die as a business if you get it very wrong, right? Because you will be outcompeted. If you get it right, so you go along to your board and you say, these are our targets. And the first thing the board say is, make them higher. And the management team go, no, we can't, we'll die. So the reality is that the question of setting a target is not a scientific route. It's a dialectic process between a governance and the management, where one side is saying higher and the other side is saying lower. And you hope that that ends up with somewhere which is reasonably possible. What we want people to have is targets that are achievable but challenging. And so we talk about ambitious targets, and in the guidance, it unpicks for you a little bit about what we mean by ambitious goals and targets. But in the end, we'll want to see evidence that there has been a debate where effectively someone acting in the interests of your stakeholders is saying higher, and somebody else is saying that's not possible. And between those two voices, we end up with a target that is challenging but achievable. But it's not a science in that sense. It's a kind of discord. Yeah.
So is it safe to therefore assume, I'm not even getting into the assurance right now. Maybe there's under discussion that we should again have once we have the assurance framework out. But for the setting of the strategy and setting of the governance process, is it safe to say that it's best to identify your key stakeholders, do a materiality with them, and on your business operations, look at your positive impacts, look at your negative impacts across all SDG, see where is it that you're really materially impacting the environment and society, pick those, see which, and of those, which all you can really work on. You may not
Correct.
be able to do all of them
That's
at
better. That's the kind of idea. I mean, it's kind of, you're close in that. I mean, key stakeholders is always a very dangerous word because key are the ones who experience the material impacts. So there's a kind of cyclical bit in that, yeah. And it's very difficult to know who they are before you start. So there is a reiterative process. What most organisations find that by year 2 they wish they'd known things when they started that they didn't know when they started. But it's the willingness to learn and show that you're making different decisions as a result of that, which is so important to us. It's not, do I have a perfect measurement system? It's, have you made any different decisions? Show us the decisions and show us that you understand the risk that when you make those decisions, not only the risk to your financials, but a risk to the people who experience the consequences.
So maybe the assurance process will also be somewhat, I'm hoping that will also be dependent not only on what numbers you have put in, but how have you come to these numbers and what,
To some extent, yes, but more importantly, that you're making decisions with that information, because we've had too long where we've been focusing on measurement and not enough time we've been focusing on decision making. Yeah. And if you think about financial markets, every business, every day makes hundreds of decisions without perfect information.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we need that kind of thinking. But I would also, I think from a point of view of advising and supporting businesses on this at the investment level, it's not just around that operational, it is the strategy piece. It's helping people putting the money in the right place at the front end. And the investment mapping piece is really important on this, because it's not much point spending a lot of time helping businesses invest money in sectors which are not having a significant contribution.
Jeremy, because we have only 2 more minutes, I'll very quickly. Are you seeing VCs really take interest in the investor mapping and therefore going back and setting up their portfolio investments according to the investor maps? Have you seen that happening now or starting to see that?
I'll let Debahuti answer that.
Sure. So, Smita, the investor maps, it's a very recent sort of exercise or undertaking, and the journey after these maps are published is a long one. And you've asked a very pertinent question, because that's what is keeping us awake at nights. That, how do these maps really translate into sizable transactions? And I feel UNDP has a role so far to say that, okay, there are these examples of transactions that we can showcase, because look at the tremendous gap in SDG financing. Even if I go by a very myopic traditional sort of definition that, there is a small pool of financing gap for the SDGs, which itself is at about $3.7 trillion per annum till 2030 for every emerging economy. So to fill in that gap, a lot of collaborators come together, and UNDP is not in the business of making investments. But what we can do is really bring together these funders, try a few formats, help make companies visible. A lot of companies that are actually doing great work are not able to reach the boardrooms of these VCs. So how do we make those visible and come to a point where we are actually able to showcase a few examples of transactions to show that yes, SDGs are investable, it makes good business sense, and this can in fact be 100% of your portfolio. So those are the kind of things that we're doing, and we are seeing a lot of traction. We recently launched the map for Indonesia, and we are seeing some activity happening there in terms of working with multinational banks.
Last 30 seconds to end this session. It's going to auto end otherwise.
Oh, okay. So I'll stop there. Suffice to say, we're working on it.
Yes. I have to have both of you again back to have a more detailed discussion with having more maybe investors come on the panel and maybe understand how these investors.
If anybody has any questions, just they can email them to you and you can forward them to us and we'll come back.
Yes, I'll make sure they will send you all the questions. Thank you so much. Really grateful for having both of you here, and we are going to be back again on a panel soon again. Yes.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.